Our goal with Stages in the 305 is pretty simple: to bring the very best of Jewish learning to Miami. So we're already blessed with extraordinary homegrown teachers and scholars right here in our community, but we're also trying to do something bigger, to put Miami on the map as a place where serious Jewish ideas are not only welcome, but expected, to raise the level of the conversation, and to bring our community the most insightful, challenging, and helpful Jewish thinkers out there. And that's exactly why we partnered this year with the Hadar Institute. You could switch the slide. If you're not already familiar, Hadar is one of the most compelling centers of Jewish learning today. They take Jewish texts seriously, very seriously, but they also insist that Torah has something to say about the moral, ethical, and spiritual questions of modern life. Hadar is rigorous without being rigid, deeply rooted in tradition without being nostalgic, and committed to a Judaism that is intellectually honest, spiritually alive, egalitarian, and morally demanding. And Hadar isn't just one Beit Midrash in New York, it's a whole ecosystem, which I invite you to explore. They run Yeshiva Hadar, and they built some of the most creative Jewish learning initiatives out there, including Project Zug, which connects learners for Habrut to study around the world, and Pedagogia Partnership, which is reshaping how Jewish learning is taught in schools and communities. And I'm proud to say that SAGE has brought both of these programs to Miami. And at the helm of Hadar is Rabbi Ethan Tucker. Rabbi Tucker is the president and Rosh Yeshiva of the Institute. He's a brilliant teacher. He holds a PhD in Talmud and Rabbinics, and he received rabbinic ordination from the chief rabbinate of Israel. But what really sets him apart isn't just his knowledge, it's his ability to take the hardest Jewish questions, the ones we argue about, worry about, and sometimes even avoid, and help us think about them with clarity, nuance, and courage. He's widely respected for his work on Jewish law, ethics, prayer, and egalitarian practice. And many of you also know him as co-host of Response Radio, where Jewish tradition becomes a living conversation rather than a closed book. And just last week, he was named one of the top 50 most innovative Jews of the last 50 years, which is quite something. Yeah. On a more personal note, Rabbi Tucker is the son of Rabbi Gordon Tucker, my own teacher, who I love, and the stepson of the late Senator Joe Lieberman, widely regarded as the Jew who came closest to the White House. Rabbi Tucker, I know your family doesn't have the best track record with Florida, so we're hoping this visit finally corrects that history. Now, before I hand over the mic, I want to tell you that you could switch to the next slide. Thank you. That we have a QR code up here for questions, and that's how we're going to select which questions to do in the Q&A. That QR code is going to appear on every one of Rabbi Tucker's slides. So anytime you have a question, you do the whole QR thing, you submit it, and then we hope we'll be able to address it at the Q&A session. And now, please join me in welcoming Rabbi Ethan Tucker.
Thank you so much, Bella, for that beautiful introduction. I'll get this out of the way. I had rotator cuff surgery. I'm doing well. I'll be back in the starting lineup next spring, not this spring, and doing just fine. It is wonderful to be in Florida. I'm not counting the 537 votes that kept us just short in 2000. But really, it's been a tremendous blessing over the last couple of years to have opportunities to come down and see the remarkable vitality and growth of this community. and particularly in the context of Jewish learning and education. I'm so grateful for this evening to the Gans family to you honor us by enabling us to honor Charlie, your son, your dad, close person in your life. It's really a privilege for us to be a part of that, for me to be a part of it. And I want to thank the folks here at Temple Judea for hosting, and the whole team at CAJE who have just been tremendous in welcoming everyone down for these series. So let's turn to our topic. What is a Jew? A Jew is someone with an identity crisis. It's someone who cannot give you a straight answer as to whether he is the member of a family, a clan, and an ethnic group, or whether she is the adherent of a religion committed to certain practices and beliefs. And we have the right slide up there for this. Why do we have that identity crisis? Partly because Jews are old. We trace ourselves back to the Iron Age, at a time when ethnicity and religion were fused. In the world of the first temple, inseparable components of your identity would have been the ethnic group to which you belonged and the religious life that formed the civilization of that group. And all kinds of biblical passages give you insight into this worldview. There's one passage in the book of Judges where the judge Yiftach engages in a rhetorical battle with the king of Ammon. And he was ordering the king of Ammon to back off any claims to land that the Israelites justly conquered from the Amorites. And he says the following, listen to the quote. So now the Lord, the God of Israel, has dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Should you possess them? Will you not possess that which Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? So whomever the Lord, our God, has dispossessed from before us, them we will possess. Yiftach, speaking on behalf of Israel, his people, and their God, rendered in English as the Lord, but by the letters Yud, He, Vav, He in the Hebrew, squaring off against Ammon and their God, Chemosh, in a territorial battle. The rhetoric here is strong, but the religious and cultural assumptions here are even stronger. Each nation has its God, which is the source and manifestation of its existence. We can go to the next slide, and you can leave it there. Being an Israelite was wrapped up with being a servant of the God of Israel. There was no real possibility of being a part of the Israelite ethnos without being a part of its religious life. And similarly, in many places, the Torah is clear that the reverse was true as well. You can't enter the nation of Israel via religious commitment alone. Again and again, the ger, the resident alien, is listed alongside the ezrach, the native citizen. And while that resident alien was meant to be protected and enjoy equal rights to the native-born Israelite, he can never become an Israelite and remains in a separate group as befits his separate ethnic origin. Passages that equate the two groups with respect to religious law nonetheless maintain them as separate and parallel. And so a close reading of the plain sense of the Torah and First Temple sources reveals there is no way for the non-Israelite man to ever become an Israelite any more than a contemporary German could become ethnically Chinese. All of this changed. You can go 2 slides later. One more. With the advent of Hellenistic society, Alexander the Great conquers the Middle East and beyond And humanity at that point in time, in the 4th century before the Common Era, gets its first taste of a truly multi-ethnic civilization. Before Alexander, the Persians had a vast empire that included many peoples with different languages and religious practices, as the Book of Esther tells us time and time again. That was truly a multicultural empire made up of different peoples. But the Persians did not really aim to have a shared civilization. This Persian Empire allowed local languages and culture to flourish under a shared bureaucracy. The Hellenistic Empire launched by Alexander was different. Multiple ethnic groups were invited to be a part of a shared civilization. So now, even if you were not of Greek ancestry, you could have a city and a state that would adopt the Greek language, Greek forms of dress, Greek gods, embrace Greek philosophy and modes of education, and have a Greek-style constitution. Next slide. That ushered in a new reality in which ethnicity was now decoupled from religion. And that plunged the Jewish people into an identity crisis from which we have not recovered until today. It's as if Alexander asked us as a community, so in this brave new world that I've created, what are you going to be? Will you be an ethnic group defined by heredity, kin, and clan? Or will you be a civilization of sorts, a religion, a set of practices and commitments that define the boundaries of your community? If Judaism is an ethnicity, then it's presumably a closed group with no way in or out except for birth and death, but also deeply accepting of those who are in the clan, no matter how religiously wayward they may be. Religious commitments might be important, even central, but they will never define who is in and out of a group defined by ethnicity. But if, however, Judaism is a religion, then it is open to all, just like Greek civilization. But religions are defined primarily by actions and commitments, and they can be abandoned. Ethnic origin is not a boundary to participation, nor is it a guarantee of salvation. And if you think about it, post-Hellenistic religions have no dilemma in this regard. They are quite clearly religions, unbound from ethnicity. Christianity, from its inception, has been a religious movement that welcomes everyone to join it, perhaps most strikingly through its embrace of all languages as valid for the Bible. Islam, also a faith with no ethnic boundaries. The early waves of Muslim conquest quickly take the practice of that religion beyond the ethnic boundaries of Arabia. You want to become a Christian or a Muslim? Commit to beliefs and practices. Your ethnic origin means nothing. And as befits faiths, they have robust notions of heresy that can render you an apostate. It is possible to abandon these faiths and no longer be a part of them. And when mission alignment comes into conflict with kinship, the former trumps the latter. Judaism, however, on account of its pre-Hellenistic origins, has struggled with these questions that I put in Alexander's mouth for many, many centuries. You look at rabbinic Judaism, its communities, its mores, its laws, its texts. You find that, in fact, Alexander's question and challenge has been responded to in two different ways at once. We find two different strands of answers to what is a Jew. And I want to sketch a broad picture of these two approaches and then consider how they continue to affect us today. So let's go to the next slide. There are a lot of biblical sources that make it clear that the Jewish people's covenant with God runs through their veins. Here's two of them. God says to Abraham in the book of Genesis, I will maintain my covenant between us, between you and me, and with your seed who will follow you for all generations as an eternal covenant, to be your God and the God of your seed who will follow. I give to you and to your seed who will follow you the land you are living in, all of the land of Canaan as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. And on the next slide in the book of Deuteronomy, you stand here today before Hashem, your God, to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God in order to maintain you as God's nation. It is not only with you that I make this covenant, says Moses in God's name to the people on the plains of Moab, but with both those who are standing here with us today and those who are not here with us today, namely us. Both of these passages talk about a covenantal relationship with unborn descendants. It's so fitting in the context of the biblical model where ethnicity and religion are fused. But a post-Hellenistic Jew reading this could easily assume, oh, I get it. The most important thing about being a Jew is your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, just by dint of being your descendants, will be a part of this story. And in fact, many elements of rabbinic thought reflect this approach, holding that ultimately the Jewish community is anchored in a certain genetic notion of peoplehood. Most of Jewish history reflected this approach as well. Most Jews today, as in the past, were made the old-fashioned way. They were born. Being a Jew by descent, or in biblical or rabbinic idiom, zera, by seed, has always been the dominant way of thinking about Jewish identity. Even today, with denominational disputes over who counts as a Jew and fathers and mothers, there is no denomination I am aware of that disputes the notion that the child of two Jewish parents is a Jew by birth. That basic fact that you do not need to be baptized into the faith. You do not need to recite a credo in order to be inaugurated into it, reflects this basic orientation that to be Jewish is to be part of a family, a clan, a tribe, a nation. It is to be a descendant of Avraham, a descendant of his descendants. The Israelites who stood as a nation at the plains of Moab, and they heard the terms of the covenant renewed by Moses. And the parties to those covenants and affirmations were not only the individuals who signed up for them in the moment, but all the blood relatives that emerged from them until the end of time. Avram's relation with God forges not only his identity and spiritual journey, as significant as that was, but the identity of an entire nation. It's like royalty that lays claim to the throne on account of ancestry, like Kohanim, who are priests in the Jewish tradition by virtue of their parents' priestly prerogatives. Most Jews are Jews because their parents were Jews. What value stands behind that approach? Why, according to this aspect of the Jewish tradition, did God enter into a relationship with a people, a nation that shares ties of kinship? Why not elect Abraham and all those who follow in his religious path, irrespective of the question of descent? Why has Jewishness always been so wrapped up in peoplehood? The next slide, Michael Wishegrad, a 20th century Jewish philosopher, is one of the many people who's asked and attempted to answer these questions, and I find he does so in an effective and pointed fashion. He writes in his book, The Body of Faith, why a covenant with the carnal instead of the spiritual seed of Abraham? Is a physical relationship that is essential? Are there not those who are Abraham's children in the spirit, who are more dear to God than a crass, perhaps unbelieving Jew who is related to Abraham in the flesh, but whose spiritual illumination is quite dim? Are not the real elect the aristocrats of the spirit who derive from all people, cultures, and races? Next slide. The difficulty with the spiritualization of the God-man relationship, writes Wishgrad, is it's untrue to man's nature, which is largely carnal, embodied. The division of man into the spiritual and the material is itself an act of abstraction that has a limited validity, but that must not obscure this basic unity of human existence. Man is not a coupling of the spiritual and material, but a creature who thinks and runs, breathes and cries, is amused and laughs. The God of Israel confirms man as he created him to live in the material cosmos. There is therefore no possibility of a divine requirement for the discarding of a part of human existence. Next slide. And that is why God's election, writes Wishgrad, is of a carnal people. By electing the seed of Abraham, God creates a people that is in his service in the totality of its human being and not just in its moral and spiritual existence. The domain of the family, the most fundamental and intimate human association, is thereby sanctified so that obedience to God does not require hate of father and mother. If you've ever opened the Gospel of Luke, you know that last line in Wishgrad is a pot shot at that other religious text. Wishgrad has a lot to say in this book. He argues that if God cares about history, God has to embrace nationality and peoplehood because that's how the world is organized. And Wishgrad argues that the election of the Jewish people confers a certain legitimacy and relevance on the national order of humanity, and that historical order can be redeemed through Israel. But what Wishgrad is also emphasizing here is that placing an emphasis on the centrality of families in human life is quite conscious. If Judaism wants to emphasize the nature of a binding, enduring, inescapable covenantal relationship with God, it's hard to think of a better basis for that than familial descent. Because what makes families distinctive is they are unchosen and non-negotiable, sometimes to our chagrin. Brothers and sisters share kinship, even if they share no ideology. Fathers and mothers see themselves in the faces of their biological children, even in the most painful and divisive arguments that transpire between them. And part of Judaism's dogged attachment to clan and tribe, points out Wishgrad, is definitely rooted in a notion of understanding God's relationship with Israel as being eternal and unwavering as the family structures in which it has been anchored. And so for this strand of the tradition, Jewishness is bodily, and it's grounded in the family of Abraham. The non-negotiability of descent is the non-negotiability of the covenant between God and Israel. No matter how much children might come to hate their parents, their biological link to them can never be severed. And that is one way of answering Alexander the Great's challenge. We are a people defined by ancestry. Yes, as a people, we received the Torah. We have always had religious and cultural practices that were very important to us. But we retain, according to this strand, our tribal and national identity from antiquity. And aside from converts that have joined us in small numbers over the course of history, that clan structure defines our essence until the present. Other sources in the canon point in a very different direction. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, pre-exilic sources, those early sources, the plain reading of the Bible, fuse ethnicity and religion, but some point more in the direction of a mission-based approach, where outsiders can join and insiders can leave. There's a lot of places where the Torah emphasizes the principle that the Ezrach, the native born, and the Ger, the resident alien, have Torah achat, one law, one rule. These are, in some sense, two separate ethnic groups, but the vector of the Torah seems to point in the direction of we're creating a society anchored around values, mission, and purpose, and anyone who is a part of it is a part of it. A post-Hellenistic Jew could have read a passage like that and easily interpreted that as a mission-based vision of what defines Judaism. And the Torah does sometimes speak of covenantal commitments, not only as obligatory, but as constitutive. If you abandon them, maybe you're no longer in the group. That same passage in Deuteronomy, talking about the covenant being made with unborn generations hence, also says the following. Perhaps there's someone among you whose heart is today turning away from the Lord our God to go worship the gods of those nations. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him. The anger and jealousy of God will be kindled against that person, and the Lord will wipe that person's name out, separating them out from all the tribes of Israel. Here you have the Torah talking about a violation of the basic grounding of the covenant. In this case, the worship of the God of Israel as opposed to other gods. You don't just get punished for that action, but you are separated out from the Israelite nation. The plain sense of the passage is that this idolater remains an Israelite, but is banished, is meant to suffer, maybe even die for the sin. But the rhetoric starts to open up the possibility that this sort of heretic, having abandoned the fundamentals of the religion, is no longer a part of God's people. In other words, the religious element, rather than the ethnic one, trumps. Now, passages like this start to lay the groundwork for a very different kind of answer to Alexander's challenge. Maybe Jews, instead of thinking of themselves as an ethnic people defined by a bloodline, will think of themselves as a religion, a way of life that can be adopted by anyone as a matter of choice, a set of beliefs and practices that come with heretical boundaries. Walking beyond those boundaries might not only cast you out of good standing, they might, in the religious model, actually remove you from the group. When Judaism is thought of as a religion, it can be abandoned even by a blue blood who can trace themselves back all the way to Abraham himself. And it can be embraced by someone who literally just learned about the existence of the Torah and the Jews the day before. There's a lot in rabbinic tradition that embraces this strand as well, most prominently the concept of conversion. Rabbinic Judaism made a fundamental decision to accept the notion that one can convert to Judaism. We now read passages about the resident alien, the ger, as referring to the proselyte, the convert, someone from foreign ethnic stock who embraces Judaism and becomes a Jew. And all strands of rabbinic Judaism, despite their arguments over every single issue under heaven, agree that conversion is part of Judaism and embrace, in that sense, a religious conception of what Judaism is. Now, what value stands behind that? We saw Wishgrad, among others, giving an articulation of the value of defining the group by clan. Well, the value of defining the group by religion is It's grounded in a certain universalist conception of humanity. It marginalizes essentialist difference between people, individuals, and nations. At root, it's really centered in the Torah. It insists that Judaism is a mission. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of acting in the world. And that is something that should be open to all. And it takes the mission seriously in that it sees little point in calling someone Jewish who does not sign on to the parameters of the faith. It's considerably more open to newcomers and considerably more harsher to the wayward. If you think of Jewish identity in this model as something you can put on like a new piece of clothing, presumably you can take it off. The best Jewish spokesman for this approach is unquestionably Maimonides. He goes well beyond Talmudic precedent when he says in his Code of Jewish Law the following: a Jew who worships idolatry is like a Gentile for all purposes. He is not like a Jew who has violated a prohibition that carries the death penalty. Here's what he means. If you open the Torah, the penalty for idol worship is death, as is the penalty for a number of other serious offenses in the Torah. Normally, when someone violates a death penalty offense in the Torah, they are a Jew who has been convicted of a serious crime. The way someone could be an American citizen who is convicted of a serious crime, and maybe even in certain states, will be condemned to death. But Maimonides is saying something different. He's saying in the case of idol worship, the person ceases to be a Jew. It's not a normal capital case. It's a case where your citizenship has been stripped. For Maimonides, if you abandoned the core ban on idolatry, there's no meaning anymore to the notion that you are a Jew. When Judaism is conceived as a religion, the notion of a Jew who does not practice Judaism is totally nonsensical. The next slide. Elsewhere, we find Maimonides laying out a fuller narrative picture of this approach. It's in a very moving letter to a convert from Islam who took on the name Ovadiah. His original name was Abdullah, which means the same in Arabic. And he writes in a moving epistle trying to converse with his addressee about his fundamental legitimacy as a Jew despite his origins. And he says the following: the core point is that Avraham, our father, is the one who taught and educated the people, informing them of the religious truth and the unity of God, rejecting idols and their worship. He brought many into the divine presence and taught, instructed, and commanded his descendants to follow God's way. Therefore, anyone in any generation who converts and anyone who unifies God's name, as is written in the Torah, is a student of Abraham, our father, and a member of his household, and Abraham himself is responsible for setting him on the right path. Abraham, our father, is thus the father to all of his descendants who properly follow his example, and also a father to all of his students and to any future convert. This is as good a summary of the religious approach to Judaism as I know. Judaism's origin is in an idea and practice first entrusted to Abraham and then passed on to anyone he would teach. You want to know who Abraham is? He is not the ethnic ancestor of the Jews. He is the first preacher of Judaism. He came to understand it despite his ethnic background, as we say at the Seder, across the river with all of his idolatrous ancestors. He was singled out to build a family around this faith, but fundamentally he was called to a substance-oriented mission that's only contingently connected to his bloodline. And Rambam, Maimonides, makes two corollaries of this approach clear. Number one, anyone who joins the people later on is just as much a child of Abraham as anyone else, because it's a religion, not an ethnicity. And second, an ethnic Jew who abandons Judaism is no longer a Jew. This is hinted at, if you caught it in Rambam's language, that Abraham is a father to all of his descendants who properly follow his example. Haholchim bidrachav. And the implication is clear. Those who do not follow his example are not his descendants, even if they can trace their DNA back to him. They're not Jews because Judaism is a religion and they don't practice it. This is a very different answer to Alexander's challenge. We are a religion, originally anchored in a specific people, but one that rises and falls on Torah and mitzvot. And the boundaries of that religion are defined by practice rather than by inheriting genetics. What's less clear is what practices are essential to Judaism. How do we define what is the essence that can't be crossed? Which violations or sins you can atone for? They're fines you can pay off while retaining your license, and which are acts of treason that remove you from the Jewish collective entirely. So these two models that we've explored here are really important goalposts, I think, for engaging this question. They mark off archetypes that I think beckon us in terms of thinking, right, on the different ends of the spectrum of possibility. I think it's fair to say rabbinic tradition as a whole has been considerably messier. The competing paradigms vying for supremacy, even as individual sources, which we could play out in an 8-part series, where you would see sometimes the rabbis are going this way, sometimes they're going that way. Give us the next slide. Conversion is possible for the rabbis. That's like religion, but it requires an embodied process. And once you convert, you have a new Jewish germline, as it were, of all of your descendants being Jewish by birth. That's kind of like being an ethnicity. Those who abandon core Jewish practices are mostly still treated as Jews. That's the ethnic model. But idolatry and public Shabbat desecration for the rabbis could ban someone from offering sacrifices in the temple and otherwise participating in communal Jewish life. That's kind of like a religion. In short, and I'm happy to go on a great length with you afterwards if you want, both strands of the answer to Alexander survive. And if you want to really understand rabbinic Judaism and Jewish culture and Jewish patterns of thought until today, they're best understood as messy because they are preserving something old, older than the entire structure of Western civilization. Because Jewishness and Judaism were forged in a world where ethnicity and religion were largely fused and inseparable. The Jewish people then passed through the revolution of the Hellenistic Empire and its creation of a multi-ethnic civilization. And so then we've been trying to sort out our response to the question, which are you, an ethnicity or a religion? Each of these models has significant benefits and significant limitations. Ethnic models grant you a certain degree of stability, self-evident definition. You are a daughter of the American Revolution if you have the papers to prove it, not based on how patriotic you are. They avoid heresy hunting. Someone's a Jew by descent. You might not like that they think this or behave that way, but there's no point in going after them and hounding them for those beliefs and practices because they're going to remain in the group no matter what. And that is the way in which the ethnic model is broadly inclusive of all members of the group, even encompassing behaviors that some may find to be religiously deviant. But ethnic models are also somewhere between grudgingly accepting to hostile to newcomers, and they have a hard time articulating mission or purpose beyond parochial survival. What you gain through peoplehood, you can easily squander through a self-serving myopia that loses sight of God's vision for humanity. Religious models, on the other hand, allow for clearer definitions in that regard. You know what you stand for, if you can agree on it, and they're quite adaptable to welcoming those who are inspired by the cause and the way of life and who want to join. When you don't judge people in any way by their origins, well, then they allow Jewishness to take new forms as needed. But religious models encourage a quest for ideological purity, and they allow for even the closest family members to turn on one another over religion. What a religious model gains in its embrace of converts, it's got to be prepared to lose in its loss of apostates. Each of these models can promote peace and harmony, and each can be deployed to inflict violence on the other. Why does this matter today? So I want to unpack this mostly in the Q&A, which will start in just a few minutes, but I'll offer you this one initial thought to bring it to our own. In the two major centers of Jewish life today, it's quite easy to detect two very different responses at work. In Israel, Jewishness unquestionably hovers closer to the ethnic pole of our constructed spectrum. The Zionist narrative is largely one of a people, not a religion, returning to its homeland and building a society for itself despite various oppositional forces and other nations. Religious debates flare in modern Israel, but there's no question that the dominant identity lines are drawn between Jews and Arabs, where Jews is conceived not primarily as a religious group, but largely ethnic. Israeli society also, some may have experienced directly or indirectly, has little interest in or compassion for converts, other than a few advocates who work really hard to change the status quo. In Israel, with its reasonably robust Jewish birth rate, Jews are mostly made the old-fashioned way. They are born. And for most Israeli Jews, that's just fine. Despite the lack of consensus around religious practice, to understate things considerably, most Israelis simply don't care if it is near impossible to navigate the state's bureaucracy as a convert. The convert is a curiosity, perhaps an admirable one, but they're on the fringes of Jewish experience, certainly can't narrate in the first person the historical events that launched Zionism and continue to shape it. Might change over time, but the ethnic anchor of Israeli Judaism is undeniable. And that leads, as the ethnic model will, to a clear sense of solidarity among Jews in Israel. We saw that suddenly surge to the surface post-October 7th, when there was a sense of the group as a group being under threat. But it's also true that Israeli society can lack a clearer sense of the purpose of being Jewish, or whether being Jewish has a message to the broader world short of simply survival. Things are very different in the United States, in North America. In some ways, American Judaism's biggest challenge, I would say to you, is that it wants it both ways. It wants to cherry pick the ethnic and religious elements of Jewishness that are most comfortable and most in tune with the patterns of American Jewish life. So American Jews love being ethnically Jewish in all kinds of ways. They don't want to be judged in or out based on how they practice. They like the notion that a child born to a Jew is unquestionably a Jew, irrespective of belief or connection to mitzvot. And Americans generally like religious freedom and agnosticism that is enabled by ethnic group definitions. You could say, in short, they love the ways in which Jewishness mirrors being in a family. But American Jews also love being religious. They resist placing emphasis on origins and love to encourage personal journeys to truth and to meaning. With high intermarriage rates in the United States, an increasing cloudiness around the ethnic family tree of, well, who really is descended from whom, how many generations back at this point, American Jews find it more tenable to define Jews on a voluntaristic basis rather than grounded in descent. And I would suggest to you, I feel I can do this because I'm one of them, the dream for many contemporary Jews is to define a Jewishness that you can be automatically born into, that has no non-negotiable behavioral expectations, including who you marry, and that welcomes anyone to join Judaism and become a full and equal member of the community. The problem, I would argue to you, is that is incoherent and unsustainable. Adopting either an ethnic or a religious frame has consequences in all kinds of directions. You can't really declare that someone born a Jew can never lose that identity while avoiding any hierarchy between the native born and the convert. You can't really welcome the convert with open arms based on an embrace of the Jewish religion and then be a total agnostic on any kind of definition of religious standards for Jewish life. American Judaism is going to have to come to terms with that dilemma, or it will devolve into a certain incoherence that will make it hard to define itself and inspire future generations. I think with current demographic trends, the ethnically dominant model that works in Israel is probably out of reach for American Jews, and it's hard to imagine that that's even desirable. But that means that the future of a vibrant and self-sustaining American Judaism almost certainly rests on a clearer embrace of the religious model. And that will bring the benefits of seeing converts as paradigms rather than exceptions, but it will also require a tougher stomach for articulating expectations for religious behavior and giving communities meaningful religious definition. But even if that succeeds, it's likely to deepen the divide between American and Israeli Jews on that front, who will increasingly be responding to Alexander the Great's challenge to us from two different poles of the spectrum of Jewishness. In some ideal world, that would be amazing. You would have two great centers of Jewish life anchored slightly differently around this core question, giving different answers, and in stereo sound, hearing one another and being informed by one another and feeling the sort of deeper symphonic truth of both of those voices. In practice, it might generate a good deal of discord and make it even harder for these two communities to understand one another. So the best counsel, I think, may be to remember that the question of defining what is a Jew, ethnicity or religion, probably that question of character of Jewishness and Judaism can never truly be resolved. You can go towards one pole, you can go towards the other. But if we're true to where we came from, which was before that split ever existed, we will probably never be able to shake either of these modes entirely. And that's because we forged a covenant with God in the ancient world as an ethnic clan. It was a covenant that was imprinted upon us a revolutionary vision for the world, and it did so on the soul of an earthly people. History will go on. We will undoubtedly continue to face different circumstances that will bring one of these aspects out over the other. But maybe our job is to embrace the messiness actually to have the courage to respond faithfully, both to our past and the conditions of the present, while we still maintain the humility to know that an eternal covenant is meant to take us into an unknown future as well. I will stop there and continue with questions, which I would love to hear, that are raised by any aspect of what I said, aspects of the specific text, some of the connection to contemporary life. I'm happy to opine on other dimensions of that. But let's hear what we've got.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was fascinating and so much to chew over. I'm not sure that the way we've done this is going to be the most effective to get the conversation going in the way you want, but we do have some excellent questions.
Great.
That were submitted. Okay, awesome. So first of all, a bunch of us have heard various versions of the thesis that one of the reasons that the younger generation is not supportive of Israel is because they lean too much into their religious Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Tikkun Olam Judaism support the rest Judaism and they've forgotten their, ethnic Judaism, and that gut reaction to just support all Jews around the world.
Right.
So what do you make of that thesis, and is there a solution to it?
Yeah. So I'll say two things about that thesis. One, it is basically correct. And I'll elaborate on that in a minute. And two, it's very important, though, to sort of fill in the mad libs, as it were, of that statement with the right adjectives and the right content. So let me unpack what I mean. On some level, it is basically correct, which is to say, and by the way, I think you see this in the subdivisions of the North American community. I was speaking to someone about this right before the talk, those who have a more recent on their flesh memory and experience of being persecuted as a group, they can live in North America. They still have a 100% ethnic conception of Judaism, of this is the group, I'm a part of it. It's in my kishkas, end of story. That's all I need to know. From my understanding from outside, Miami is a community that has a stronger percentage, right, of people with both that background and that outlook. And there is no question that the mean average, right, young American Jew, mostly, we're now in a moment of asterisk, right, post-October 7th and rising anti-Semitism in various contexts, but mostly had the experience of their ethnicity not mattering all that much. And therefore, the way they thought of themselves going through the world is the way America intended them to think of themselves, which was as citizens and as equals, who were simply called upon to live out ideals and commitments in their life. In that way, fundamentally, you are dealing with two different societies, two different human experiences. And so once you come up against the sense that, well, wait a minute, my fellow Jews are doing things I disapprove of, you will potentially look at it not from the lens of, okay, but those are my people, so maybe I'll have some argument with them, but that's going to happen totally internally, to, I'm not sure those are my people, right? If you want to fit it into sort of the frame of my talk, the religious orientation leads you to see apostates, leads you to see people who abandon the faith, whatever the principle of faith is, the political orientation, and that will become what it is. I don't know how many of you watched, it's really on a different angle, unfortunately, including ethnicity, but right, the All-American Halftime Show, okay, is a manifestation, a cultural manifestation of deciding America is not everyone who lives in America. There are certain things that are the right America and the wrong America. And that is actually a sort of religious conception, if you will, of politics, which we are increasingly drawn into. The piece that I think I would nuance from the way it was articulated in the question is the articulation of, it's about, tikkun olam and forgetting your Jewish background or Jewish principles, and it's just this sort of highly universalistic take. I know there are people for whom let's say their anti-Zionism is shallow, is grounded fundamentally in ignorance. But I think if you want to understand the root of the most difficult places where the Jewish community confronts this among the youth, it's where there are people who actually have a narrative of what I understood the substance of Judaism to be would point me, for instance, not to do the things that the Israeli army did in Gaza. Now, we can argue with that. I would argue with that. I have argued with that. But if we want to understand it, it actually, I think, for many people is coming from a place of a form of Jewish religious conviction, but that indeed potentially pits the person against people in the group. Just to go back that line I mentioned, it comes from the Gospel of Luke, when Wyshegrod is sort of championing, this is so amazing, the family ethnic model of Judaism. It does not force someone into hate of father and mother. That is because in the Gospel of Luke, one of the selling points, as it were, of Christianity in that document, I don't know if it's a selling point, but one of the criteria is no one shall come to the Father unless they hate their father and mother. Now, it doesn't mean Christians want everyone to hate their parents, but what it means is there's a clarity of statement there of, we're asking you to sign up for a religion that is new. Your parents aren't Christian. You're going to have to abandon them. I don't know if Ruth hated her parents, but she was prepared to abandon them in order to join a new group. And that's the sense in which that's a conflict. Yeah.
Thank you so much. A few other questions. A shorter one. How does the view that focuses on the body and ethnicity, I guess, explain the biological diversity of Jews, if not through massive conversions in the past?
Right. Great. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I'll get closer to the mic. I'm sorry. How does the view that focuses on the body explain the biological diversity of Jews, if not through massive conversions in the past?
Good. Okay, so let's be clear. There are two kinds of ways. Let's imagine, we're not going to get into the data, to what degree can we map this historically? But imagine that there's some actual, genetic stock of Jacob and the 12 tribes, et cetera, et cetera. How do we get from what that would seem to be, right, some one family into the diversity of today? There are two ways in which that kind of diversity can come about, right? So one, to clarify, is yes, there's the notion of entire groups of people converting to Judaism, like the Khazar kingdom in the Middle Ages in Central Asia. Those are very rare instances overall in Jewish history, though the conversion of that Khazar kingdom does seem to have provided some meaningful anchor for Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewry. So definitely that is the case. But most of the intermingling is, whether there was official conversion or not, people who married, had children, etc., in a world of matrilineal descent. Sometimes there were male genes, right, that came in, whether through licit or illicit relationships. There are all kinds of ways in which that develops. Well, I'll sort of answer and reframe the question in this way to answer it. To the extent the question is on Wyshegrod, which is to say, you're giving me this whole thing that is all about the body, the clan, et cetera, but it seems like there have been a lot of converts. So what do you do with that? Yes, for people engaging in the deeper aspects of Jewish thought, this is one of the things that Wyshegrod will be critiqued for. I'll say, you don't really take conversion seriously. It's actually a serious thing in terms of rabbinic conception of the religion, and maybe historically you're also not giving it its fair shake. Wyshegrod actually in one other place of his writing says, conversion is a miracle. I don't understand how it could possibly work, but it does work. And in some ways that shows his failure to understand it, which is it really represents the non-ethnic strand, right, of rabbinic Judaism. So for sure that mixing has happened. But again, it has also sometimes happened kind of under the radar or in small numbers here and there. I think the simplest point to make is this about conversion. How many converts did Christianity have? What percentage of Christians were converts? The answer is 100%. Right? In other words, then there are descendants, but the answer is 100%. The way you feel this, I think, actually most strikingly, the Jewish lack of focus on conversion. Again, interesting people who are slight exceptions to this rule. But the Jews have no mission to the Gentiles. I don't mean that philosophically. I mean that monetarily and structurally. You go into a church, there's a plate that will be passed around. You can contribute to it. Those resources will, in part, maybe in meaningful part, be going to reach out to new people to bring them in. There are just a smattering of rabbis in North America who in any way think of their portfolio as being about encouraging or enabling conversion to Judaism. Mostly that happens through the congregations, where there is a congregant who might be marrying someone or someone who wants to join that congregation. That will become the rabbi's constituent. But the notion of there being at-large constituents of potential Jews for whom we hire and deploy rabbis, our Jewish communal structure has essentially exactly zero of that. And that reflects the ethnic mentality.
And Rabbi, what do you think of that?
I think that is one of the moves that we have to make. That is to say, I think when we take seriously the need to turn the volume up on aspects of the religious component, I am not the person to go into the proselytizing business. I'm not sure I have the cadence of speech or the energy or all of that. But I think if the Jewish community, in a world where ethnicity is increasingly muddled, wants to take itself seriously, it has to actually invest in what it would mean to spread the mission and substance of Judaism to people who are potentially interested in joining.
Wow.
That's for another talk.
Do we have time for more? Yeah, okay. So we have an interesting question. With Purim around the corner, this person is thinking about how Haman defied Judaism and Jewishness, a people to be murdered for crime did not commit. Do you think the Abrahamic descent argument for a biological link to the covenant is in concert or in tension with the way these anti-Semites defined a Jew? I'm not sure I understand this question.
I think I got
it?
enough. Yeah. Is this our last one or we're having another one after this? Depends how long I go.
One, and then everyone will come and have
Good. So this will be the last one. I'll just wrap. I actually think the question from the book of Esther and Haman is an excellent one, and in some ways an excellent one to tie us back to the beginning of where I started. So, right, the idea is that Alexander the Great, Hellenistic civilization, is this new idea that really never existed. The idea of a multi-ethnic civilization, a shared civilization of multi-ethnics, and that the Persians were different, right? The Persians were a multi-ethnic empire with a shared bureaucracy, but not with a shared civilization. And if you pay attention to Haman's language in the book of Esther, he fits exactly with the pre-Hellenistic model. He says, Yeshno am echad, there is a people, mifzar miforad bein amim, who are scattered in all kinds of places in the empire. V'datehem shonot mikol am, and their religious ways are different, probably almost best translated as weirder and more annoying than those of any other people. What does Haman actually take for granted? Haman takes for granted that the Jewish people are an ethno-religious group. They are an am that has dat. They are an ethnos that has a religion. And on some level, for him, it's obvious that you are going to stamp that people out with all of that bundled up together. Anti-Semitism throughout history has then been very complicated. And it's interesting, I think, and worthwhile to think about and try to diagnose what it looks like today. The Rambam famously has another in his epistle to the Jews of Yemen, who are suffering through tremendous persecution, says, the Gentiles have come at us in a lot of different ways, and we'll always survive them. He says, sometimes they come after our body. Sometimes they come after our soul. Sometimes they hate who we are and want to kill us. Sometimes all they want to do is strip the religion away. Greek Hellenistic anti-Semitism was only about erasing Judaism. We say that in the Al-Anisim prayer on Hanukkah, to cause the Jews to forget their Torah and to stop following the laws. Greeks didn't want to kill us. Just get in line, eat pork and offer, sacrifices to the emperor. What's the matter with you? Go naked to the gymnasium and that's it. We'll all be happy, right? Nazi anti-Semitism, right? Didn't care if you converted to Christianity. That didn't matter. You were a pollutant on the Aryan race, right? Just those two, right? As simple examples of this show you how whether anti-Semitism can or even should be used to describe that in that form. And when we talk today, right, maybe one of the other things you can take from this talk is there's big arguments. Is there more anti-Semitism on the left or is there more anti-Semitism on the right? I'm not going to answer that question for you, okay? But I would say it is worthwhile looking at whether those are even the same phenomena in terms of the ethnic religious question. That is to say, you can have two things that are quote unquote bad for the Jews. And one of them may fundamentally be fine with your body, but trying to reprogram your worldview. And the other may actually be offended by your very existence because you don't fit into the ethno-nationalist group that you are trying to construct. Maybe the most useful thing we can do when we think about how to diagnose and combat anti-Semitism is to understand better who we are, to understand this complexity, and then figure out who's coming for which parts of us, and how do we make sure we are the most robust and vital that we can be to outlast them. Thank you very much.